Does the Bible have relevance to your life? Does the Bible have anything to do with how you should be living life? Does the Bible have answers that will assist you in dealing with the circumstances that you face every day as you live life on this planet? We're going to explore that question today. We're going to see whether or not the Bible will help you, will assist you in knowing how to cope with life's tough circumstances. I invite you to stay tuned.
Till the good news was written and the full truth revealed, that the church might be whole and Christ's fullness made real. Our Lord in His wisdom gave men gifts from above. The Spirit then taught them the truth in love.
Welcome to The Truth in Love. And now your host, Dave Miller.
I am delighted that you have chosen to tune into our program and to study with us from the Word of God. I invite you to get paper and pencil or pen and get your Bible. Let's go to the words of God. Let's feed our spirits. Let's nourish our souls. I believe the Bible has the answers to all of the critical questions of life and human existence. And I thank you again for choosing to tune in and to study with us. In our last program, we had worked our way up in the book of Genesis to chapter 21 and chapter 22, where the child of promise, that is, the son of Abraham and Sarah, had been born, Isaac. And then God said, you're to take him out and execute him. Abraham, out of a simple trusting faith, made every preparation to do that, but God stopped him. And then we turned then from chapter 22 on into the next chapter, and we reached the phase of life where Sarah, at the age of 127, you know, ages were longer back at this point in history, especially prior to the flood. Human ages were very lengthy. After the flood, they began to decline, and so they didn't live as long as they did prior to the flood. But at this point in history, there's still quite a bit of length to human ages. Sarah was 127 when she died. Now remember, Abraham came from Ur, over 500 miles away. So he's in a foreign country. He's in a different land. And therefore, here is his wife. She's now deceased. He has no place to bury her. There were no funeral homes on various street corners like there is now. Therefore, he has to make a deal with some of the locals that lived in that part of the world in order to purchase a piece of real estate, some acreage that he could use as a family entombment plot. He purchased a piece of property that is described as wooded. It had a cave situated at one end called the Cave of Machpelah, and that's where he gently laid the body of his wife to rest. Then the Bible turns our attention to Abraham's concern about his son Isaac. Isaac is now 40 years old. Abraham is getting up in years. He's concerned about his son's well-being and his future. He'd like to get the boy settled into life before he himself exited this life. And therefore, he selects one of his stewards, his servants, and he sends him all the way back to their homeland up in Ur in order to select a wife for his son Isaac. So this fellow goes back and does some investigation and some interrogation, I suppose, and he finds this woman. Her name is Rebekah. She is described in the Bible as a beautiful woman, and he convinces this woman to come over 500 miles in order to meet and marry a man whom she had never seen. Isn't that incredible? And yet she agrees to do that, and that chapter closes with us being informed that Isaac was comforted by this marriage, even in the face of the death of his mother. Well, next we are told that Abraham was well up in years, 175 years old. After the death of Sarah, by the way, he remarried. He married a woman named Keturah and had some children by her. But then he himself came to the end of his life, and the Bible informs us that his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, took their father's body and placed it beside Sarah in the cave of Machpelah. Now the Bible directs our attention to the next phase of God's outworking of His redemptive purposes. And notice that's what's going on here. The Bible is not merely recording history. It's not merely a book of historical curiosities that's just telling you some things that happened. God is selectively, through inspired men, reporting to us certain events in the lives of certain peoples at certain points in history, all of which forms a complete picture of God's redemptive purposes. That is, His unfolding scheme of redemption, His plan by which human beings can be saved from sin and reconciled to their Creator. And therefore, God chose to work through certain individuals, beginning with Abraham, ultimately to bring Jesus into the world. So that's what's going on in these stories. And notice that these people are not always perfect people. They're not sinless. In fact, many times early in their life, they're very immature and do inappropriate things, make wrong decisions, just like people today. And yet many times God will work with them over a period of time, mature them, help them to grow in their spirituality, and eventually as they approach the end of their life, many times they are paragons of spiritual strength, the great patriarchs that we typically think of in the Old Testament. So the Bible now turns our attention to the fact that Isaac and Rebekah have been married for 20 years, and yet they have no children. And so Isaac is 60 years old, and this tormented his wife. Women in antiquity, I think, were bothered a great deal more than they are today if they're not able to have children. And that has been the case in different cultures in ancient times. So she was very bothered by that. So Isaac interceded on her behalf. He prayed to God that his wife might be permitted to have children. And you better be careful what you pray for. The Bible informs us that she became pregnant with twin boys. And it's interesting. The first boy that was born, you've seen children born that have a full crop of hair. Do you know when this little fellow was born, the first child, the Bible says he had hair all over his body. And therefore that's what they named him, hairy. That is the meaning of the Hebrew word Esau. When his twin brother was born, curiously enough, the Bible informs us that he had in his grasp, his grip, the heel of his older brother. So that's what they named him. The Hebrew word Yaakov, we pronounce it Jacob, means heel grabber, heel clutcher. And you know that expression, that term came to be used figuratively to refer to a person who is a con man, a deceiver, somebody who is a shyster, who will slip up behind you and trick you behind your back. And it's interesting as we read through the early lives of these two young men, these two boys, Jacob lives up to that name. Do you remember as they were approaching adulthood? The Bible informs us that Esau grew up in those adolescent years enjoying the outdoors. You know, he became a hunter, a fisherman. Whereas Jacob, more of a mama's boy, he liked to stay around home, around the tents, and learn how to cook. And one day Esau came in from an extended hunting tour. He had apparently been out away from home for some time. He came in famished. He thought he was going to starve to death. And here was his brother cooking up this pot of stew, and like typical brothers, here was the conversation. Esau said, you know, I'm hungry, will you please give me some of that stew? And Jacob says, no, why should I? What will you give me? Isn't that like brothers? And Esau said, what do you want? And Jacob said, I want your birthright. Now here was a prized possession. This was to be bestowed only upon the firstborn son in Hebrew families. And you know, Esau said, what good's a birthright if I die from hunger? And therefore he sold it to his brother. Well, turn to Hebrews chapter 12. You know, in Hebrews chapter 12, we are informed that Esau was a profane man when he sold his birthright. That was an act of profanity. You see, profanity is where you take something that ought to be held up in reverence, respect, high esteem, and treat it as if it's trivial, it's common, it doesn't matter. That's why when people use God's name in vain, how often do you hear people in the workplace and on television saying, oh my God? That's just commonplace. It just comes out of people's mouths constantly. And other forms of profanity. That's profanity. God's name ought to be held up in reverence and used respectfully and honorably. And yet people just use it as if it means nothing. It's disrespectful. That's profane. Esau was pronounced a profane man because he allowed physical hunger to override a higher concern, a greater consideration in his life. Notice, even though hunger and thirst and breathing air, all of these are legitimate physical needs. God created our body where we need these things. We are never permitted to allow our fleshly desires to offset or to conflict with spiritual concerns. That's why when Satan approached Jesus in Matthew 4 at the great temptation, and he said, here's stones, why don't you turn these into bread? Jesus had been fasting for 40 days, the limits of human endurance. Jesus quoted from the book of Deuteronomy and said, man shall not live by bread alone, food alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Even the legitimate need of hunger is not to be allowed to go against or to set aside the need to be responsive to God whenever there are certain requirements that He places upon us. What a tremendous lesson. So Esau sold that birthright. And of course, after he was well fed, he was kind of irritated that he had done that. And yet, sometime after that, it came time to bestow what was called the family blessing. This was different from the birthright, but this also was to be bestowed upon the firstborn of the Hebrew sons. Do you know this time? Jacob, in league with his own mother, Rebekah, conspire to swindle Esau out of the family blessing. And you remember they were successful in doing that. And this made Esau so angry that he was fit to be tied. In fact, he entertained murderous thoughts toward his brother. And when Rebekah found out about that, she went to Jacob and said, your brother's very upset with you. You need to leave here for a few days until he cools down. And she recommended that he go visit with some of her relatives. Well, Jacob took his mother's advice. And he traveled out of Palestine back up into the vicinity of their ancestral homeland. And by the way, rather than staying gone for a few days, do you know he ends up being gone for 20 years? When he arrived up there where his ancestors had come from, he arrived at a central watering hole, a well, where all of the locals would gather at one time before they unsealed the well in order to water their livestock. And when he arrived at that location, he took up a conversation with some of those locals. He said, do you know the family of so-and-so, the people that he was kin to and that he was looking for? And they said, yes, we know that family. In fact, here comes his daughter. And sure enough, here came a beautiful young woman. Her name was Rachel, with the family sheep. When she arrived at the watering hole, the Bible says that Jacob convinced her to sit down, and they began having a discussion. And I mean, he was instantly struck by this beautiful young girl. And the Bible says before that conversation was over, they kissed. He stole a kiss from this girl. She ran home, and he sat there and wept over how moved he was by this girl. And then he went on in the direction of where this family resided. And you remember he encountered his future father-in-law. And the fellow welcomed him in, was glad that he had come for a visit. After about a month, he had helped around the estate, and the Laban said, just because you're kinfolk, there's no reason why you shouldn't be compensated for the assistance that you're giving to our life here. What would you like for me to pay you? Name your wages. And you remember Jacob said, I'd like to marry that youngest daughter of yours. And Laban said, okay, if you will work for me on the estate for 7 years, I will let you marry that girl. And Jacob agreed to those terms. The Bible says that those 7 years of essentially hard labor seemed like a few days to Jacob. So in love was he with Rachel. And yet when the day of his wedding came, do you know he had done to him what he had done to others? He had acted as a con man, a deceiver, and that's exactly what happened to him. The women were switched, and he was married to the wrong woman, a different woman, the sister of Rachel. And the Bible tells us that in order for him to go ahead and take Rachel as his wife, he had to work an additional 7 years. So there's 14 years of labor in order to have the right to be married to Rachel, the one true love of his life. And the Bible tells us during those 14 years and the next 6 years that he and his father-in-law's relationship deteriorated. Laban would make promises and say, okay, if you'll do this, I'll do this, and then he wouldn't keep his word. And yet in spite of all of that, and in spite of Jacob's own immaturity, God had a plan that he was working out through Jacob. And so the Bible indicates that God blessed Jacob increased his wealth, his livestock, those things that were considered at that point in history the signs of a wealthy man. Jacob was able to accumulate. And there are moments in the life of Jacob where God would have a direct interaction with him and work with him and talk with him and shape him spiritually. Finally, at the end of 20 years, Jacob had had enough of his father-in-law adjusting the terms and not following through on his word, and therefore he decided he was going to pack up all of his belongings, all of his wives and children, and just leave. And he did so. And it was a few days before Laban, who lived in the vicinity, found out what had happened. And so he set out to overtake this caravan of his son-in-law and his daughters and grandchildren. But you know, before he did, God spoke to him in a vision and said, "You don't hurt Jacob when you find him, because I have plans for him." And so when Laban overtook him, he was kind of in a huff. He said, "You know, why did you leave without even allowing me to kiss my children and grandchildren goodbye?" And so they had a kind of a patching up of their differences. And then Laban went on back home, and Jacob turned in the direction of his home, which you remember he had left 20 years earlier, 2 decades before, and he had left under very unpleasant circumstances. That is, he left with his own brother angry enough to kill him. And so as you continue reading in these chapters of Genesis, guess what we find out? We find out that Jacob is so concerned about being reunited with his hostile brother that he begins making arrangements to deal with his brother in the event that his brother still holds ill will toward him. Here's what he does. He takes his entire estate, all of his livestock, all of his possessions and people, and he divides them into 2 groups, 2 bands. The idea being that if Esau is angry and he attacks one, then perhaps the others will escape. Then he arranges for successive waves of gifts to go out in front of the household estate. And each one of these gifts, consisting of various livestock, are attended by a particular servant. Each one of these servants is given the same instructions from Jacob. Whenever they encounter Esau, they are to make a little speech. They are to say, "These are gifts from your servant Jacob, your slave Jacob, for my lord Esau." Isn't that interesting how people operate in trying to patch up their differences? Then after arranging for these waves to go out in front of the family as they approach Esau's home, you remember how Jacob then takes his entire family and moves them across a natural little barrier, geographical barrier, little stream. And the night before he is to meet his brother, he has another direct encounter with God that is life-changing, life-transforming. We're seeing a maturing going on in Jacob's relationship with God and his determination to truly place himself under the directions of God. And then, before he meets his brother, he arranges his family this way. This is a fascinating tidbit from history. He takes the 2 handmaidens with their children and puts them out in front. Then he takes Leah and puts her next with her children. And then he puts Rachel, the girl that he really wanted to marry, at the very back of the pack with her one child, Joseph. And this is how he arranges them as they prepare to meet Esau. The Bible teaches the next morning, whenever it came time for him to encounter his brother, he saw his brother coming, and his brother had 400 men with him. Now you know that must have unnerved Jacob, but he was trusting in the God of heaven. Therefore, as he came within eyeshot of his brother, the Bible tells us Esau ran at Jacob. Now I know that must have scared Jacob to death. He must have thought, I'm dead. My brother's still angry. He's going to do away with me. And yet the Bible says when Esau met Jacob, that he embraced his brother and kissed him. And after that tearful reunion, Esau said, what were all these gifts that you sent out here in front of your estate? And Jacob said, he gave the same speech. "These are gifts for my lord Esau from your servant, your slave, Jacob." And Esau said, "I don't need this stuff. I have plenty." And yet Jacob insisted. He kept pressing his brother to accept these gifts, no doubt out of guilt. I mean, he had swindled his brother out of his birthright and out of the blessing, and I suppose that haunted him. He's older, he's more mature. He was regretful for what he had done, and therefore he insisted that his brother receive these gifts. And so Esau graciously accepts and then turns around and goes back. Jacob takes his time because he has a lot of livestock, he has smaller children. And the Bible then turns our attention, basically in Genesis chapter 37, to the next phase of God working out His redemptive will. We are informed in chapter 37 that Jacob had 12 sons and 1 daughter. And as the story turns in chapter 37, clear to the end of Genesis, chapter 50, we have tremendous focus being brought to bear upon a single individual, the single most important character from this point forward in the book of Genesis is a fellow named Joseph, who at the time we meet him is but a teenager. And I want to suggest to you as we move into this narrative, we won't be able to finish it today, but we'll continue it in our next program. I want you to understand that Joseph was a type of Christ. There's a lot of typology in the Bible. Events and circumstances and people in the Old Testament prefigured, kind of anticipated and symbolized some of the New Testament events where God's will was brought to climax, to fruition. And that is certainly the case with Joseph. He is a type of Christ. You remember the statement that was made about Jesus in the New Testament? He came to His own, but His own received Him not. That describes Joseph. Do you remember how Jesus came to save people from their sin, and yet the very ethnic group, the very people that He had actually initially come to, ended up killing Him. And yet He became their Savior. That's like Joseph. Joseph, even though his brothers wanted to kill him and ultimately mistreated him sorely, he turned right around and became their Savior. Well, in Genesis 37, we're introduced to him when he is but 17 years old. We are informed that the family climate was not good. The other brothers were very jealous of Joseph. Joseph had been born to his father when his father was getting up in years, so he had special feelings for the boy. He gave Joseph gifts that he didn't give the other brothers. For example, that multicolored tunic, that famous coat of many colors. Joseph had the ability from God to interpret dreams, and he made the mistake one day of telling his brothers about some dreams that he had had that placed them in a subservient position under him. That didn't sit well with them. Overall, we have a very unhealthy family situation in which the brothers really hated Joseph. They were jealous of him. They were envious of him. They could not speak a kind word to him. That sets the stage then for that day when all of those brothers were out on family business. And Jacob came to his young teenage boy Joseph and said, I need you to go out and check on your brothers. They were at Shechem, a good 60 miles from home. He was concerned about him, and so he sent the boy out. Whenever he arrived there, you remember they were nowhere to be found, and therefore one of the locals saw him wandering around out in the field and said, who are you looking for? And he said, I'm looking for my brothers. The man said, well, they were here, but I heard them say they were going on further to the north, another 10 or 12 miles toward Dothan. And so Joseph turned his attention in that direction. And off he went, and when his brothers saw him coming, their response was not good. One of them said, hey, behold, look, here comes the dreamer, talking about the dreams that he had had. Let's kill him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. What a terrible way to view your brother. That's where we'll end today, and in our next program, we'll continue this study. Stay tuned. I'll be back in just a moment.
On Zion's glorious summit they stood, the numerous hosts redeemed by blood. They hymned their King in strains divine. I heard the song and strove to join. I heard the song and strove to join. Hear all who
I am absolutely delighted that you tuned into our program today. You know, the Bible is filled with such rich treasures, such relevance to human life and existence. I would like to make this information available to you. It's an entire series entitled The Message of the Bible. And in order to receive your free copies of audio cassette tapes, all you have to do is write us at The Truth in Love. That's P.O. Box 865, Hurst, Texas 76053. Feel free to sit down this week, write us at that address, request the free audio cassette tapes on the program, The Message of the Bible. We would be happy to send it to you with no cost or no obligation. We simply want you to learn the Bible and apply it to your life. Again, I hope you've enjoyed our study and that you'll plan on tuning in again as together we study from the Word of God. In the meantime, may God bless you richly.
Now the full revelation has been given to man. Let us strive for the kingdom by God's clear plan. We must never be swayed by the doctrines of men. Speak the truth in love and grow up unto Him. Following God, following God, following God, following God, following God, following God above. Speaking the truth.